The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, and welcome to ExamSoft's webinar series. We're joined today by Eric Ermy, who is the Program Manager for Assessment and Evaluation at The Ohio State University School of Medicine. Eric will be highlighting a white paper that he has recently published on how to use real-time performance data to affect student learning outcomes. The session is set to, you can ask questions, and we'll address those questions at the end of the webinar. If you look in the control panel on your on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a place where you can ask questions. It's down toward the bottom under a section called Questions, appropriately enough. Ask your questions, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. With that, I will turn the presentation over to Eric.
Thanks, Ken, and thank you for taking some time today to join us to go through what we've been doing here. This is something that's been a long time in the making for us. We set out years ago to try and improve our student learning outcomes and do it in a data-driven method. And we've made some real great strides towards that, and I'm excited to share some of those with you today. As we go through the presentation, we're going to go through a few things. The background of why we created the system we created, what we use it for, how we use it, how we implemented it, and I'll keep that part rather brief. I'll describe the system itself, and then the most important thing will be how we utilize it within our curriculum. And we've lovingly nicknamed it the TEDDQ system. It's a tagged electronic database of exam questions, and it's really the power and the genesis of everything that we're able to do comes from this system and having these questions tagged in these different ways. And then we're going to go through some very specific examples of intervening with students and using the student performance reports to targetedly intervene to help students kind of illuminate areas that they didn't necessarily recognize as weaknesses, and take the guesswork out of helping someone who maybe isn't very self-aware, and as many students who struggle aren't very self-aware. This takes the guesswork out of trying to help them because they may tell you what the problems are, but they may not actually know. And then lastly, some applications and conclusions that are not medical school specific, but just educationally specific and educationally, I should say, general. The things that we needed to address when we started this whole project of taking our existing question bank and putting a categorization scheme on it so that we could get results based on those categories. And one of the things is, how do we provide better, more comprehensive feedback to our students in our curriculum? How do we utilize that? And how do we, going back to the first question, how do we create it in a way that makes utilizing it easy? And how do we then take this data that we generate and, rather than sitting and looking at a report of it, try and make actual changes to our curriculum, to our students, to the way we do things using it? The desired outcomes for us were to provide better performance feedback to students and faculty, and increase the assessment relevance and improve remediation. We wanted to really target these things because if we increase the relevance, then we're going to get better data about our students from those assessments. And if we improve remediation, we're going to have students moving forward without having large learning deficits that are just being masked by something. We want to enable our students to better self-assess their performance in aid and self-directed learning, to give them an idea on how to improve, because resources are limited and we can't intervene with every single student to the depth that we would like to. And then create better tools for our counselors, tutors who work with students, like I was talking about before, take the guesswork out of their jobs. Help them help the students better. They're the ones who are experts at counseling them through academic issues, personal issues, tutoring them through the material, but they're not necessarily experts in assessment. And so we wanted to kind of find a way to bridge those two worlds to make it easier on both of us. And then lastly, provide useful insights to our students on how to prepare for licensure exams, because whether it's a medical school, they have to take USMLE Step 1, Step 2, and Step 3. Nursing, they take, I think in Ohio it's called the NCLEX. The praxis exams for teachers, whatever area it is, people have to prepare for license exams. Schools are judged on them, students are judged on them, and we wanted to provide useful tools to our students in preparing for those exams. So the tagged electronic database of exam questions, we made 6 category groupings. And the groupings are, 1, the curricular unit. So every question within our database, and we have about 4,000 questions, is tagged with what block of our curriculum. Our curriculum operates in 4 to 5 week blocks. And then it's almost like a self-contained course for 4 to 5 weeks, and they move on to something else in a different organ system. And so we wanted to know what unit of our curriculum did this question belong to. Who was the faculty author of this question, or in case where it was written 20 years ago by somebody who's retired now, who's currently responsible for that content? So if a student would have a question about getting that question right or wrong, or what it was testing, or why they didn't get it right, they would know who to go to. The question type, we wanted to look at what does a question actually test? What are we assessing on the student? Their ability to recall a specific piece of information, or their ability to interpret data, their ability to synthesize, complex, patient vignettes where they have to take several steps to get to a correct answer. And we wanted to make sure we knew what we were assessing and what our focus of our assessments were. The general area, and this is a pretty medicine-specific thing for any non-medical schools who are attending right now. The general areas is a normal body process or an abnormal body process. The example being maybe how the liver works versus what happens when you have cancer. And we did that because that maps to our licensure. And so whatever your licensure is, whether you're medical school or somebody else, we can map a lot of these things to what our students are responsible for on licensure exams. And that way they're getting feedback on things that they can see what it relates to, and they can see why it's important, because this is directly what you're going to be tested on for licensure. We link those things intentionally. We use 20 subject areas that are provided by the USMLE, which is our licensing body. And what these are is when our students take licensure exams, there are 20 categories that they get a score feedback in. Here's how you did in anatomy. Here's how you did in biochemistry. Here's how you did in pathology. And we wanted to make sure that we were giving them that same feedback, because those things, we don't have courses on anatomy and biochemistry and pathology. They're all integrated in our curriculum. And again, this is something where that's very medical school specific, but there are integrated things in any form of education, in any form of curriculum, and identifying those is very important, because just because we don't want to teach them in a silo as their own individual course doesn't mean that maybe assessing them and seeing how they're doing on a particular part doesn't have value. And then we have specific subject subcategories. And again, this is another link to our licensure exam. Our specific subcategories, if we choose biochemistry, there's a group of subcategories that are linked to that. And we want to know what in biochemistry, on a little bit more granular level, what are we assessing. And so here's a table of our categories. And you can kind of see the different ones, and I described a lot of them there before. And we tried to set all of this up in a simple way. The implementation was very, very smooth. And we'll get to a little bit more about it in a couple more slides here. But one of the things that we knew when we went into this was if it wasn't easy, if it wasn't intuitive, and if it didn't provide way more value than work for our faculty, then it was not going to work, and it was not going to be adopted, and our faculty just, they would refuse. And so that was, because that was at the heart of our design of it, we came out with a product and a method of doing this that is relatively simple. It takes, for a 100 to 150 question exam, it maybe takes an hour, hour and 15 minutes to tag it with the correct categories. It's easy to put in the simple. We made forms and templates and things to really make the process smooth. And the value that comes back from that hour and 15 minutes is very, very large. And I'll show you that as we go forward as well. Here's an example of some of our specific ones. And so I'll flip back here for a moment. If you look at the subject category and you see all those different subjects there, they're linked by the number. So if you then look at, okay, number 2, biochemistry, here's all the biochemistry, or a section of them. There's actually hundreds and hundreds of these. A section of those categories. And for us, we use the study guide for USMLE Step 1 to map the content that we wanted to have here. And we took the content straight out of that so that it would have more value to our students. And you could do that with any licensure exam guidelines. So here's an example of a question from our cardiology block. And this is where some of the power of the system comes in. We have our question in ExamSoft. We have the scoring is all done through them. And so what it produces for us is when the students take an exam, we get all these statistics about the question, which from an assessment view is great. We can tell, does it discriminate? Are good students doing better on the question than our worst students? Does it correlate with doing well on the exam as a whole? We can, get some really valid assessment statistics to judge our questions by. It has the question right there. In this case, there was a image that is associated with it, so you see that on the side there. And then also you have a little spot for each of the category tags. And so a professor would just simply go through and fill in each of these little boxes down here. Sometimes some of them did it on paper, some of them did it in Word, some of them did it in Excel. It didn't really matter how they did it. They could do it whatever was more comfortable and easier for them, and it would go really quickly for them. And it was a good reason to kind of relook at every single question. So here's some examples of the reports, and this is where the real value of the system comes in, because if you do all these things and you study yourself and you know everything there is to know about yourself and you don't do anything about it, then what's the point? And the reports give us that power. We wanted to give an overall class performance breakdown to our faculty, because the aggregate of this data, the whole class data given to the faculty, allows them to make observations and changes to our actual curriculum that are based on real data. And the greatest example I have is that when we wanted to pilot this, we have one area where we consistently do pretty poorly on the boards, or we had, I should say. And our person in charge of that block spent tons of time redoing that section of the curriculum over and over and over again, just revamping it every single year with no change in result. And when we wanted a pilot person, we went to him because we knew that he was so desperate to get his area better that he would do anything. And he was the first one to buy in for us. And the next year when he had this data to use, he was able to make targeted corrections to his block, spend some more time on this topic, not as much on that, because they're getting 100% of the questions on that topic right and only 30% right on this topic. And these are, when he got a full mapping really of what they were testing versus what they were teaching, he found that it didn't line up very well. And he was able to make very targeted, specific corrections to the block, and subsequently we were able to see an improvement in those areas of our student scores on the boards. Less people failed those blocks, et cetera. And that was a great selling point to all the other block leaders. If they could see this guy get it turned around and they knew that this block had been the poorest performing for years and years and years, they knew that it would be valuable for them as well. We have student performance breakdown reports that are exam specific. And after every single exam, our students get a report of their performance in every category that was on that specific exam. If a question has, a couple subjects tagged on, a couple subtopics, authors, so on, all those are aggregated over the course of the exam. And just for one exam, here's how you did. Not you got an 85% and you missed 15% and we don't know what that is. But we can very detailedly break down for the student, what did you miss? Where was that other 15%? Why do you consistently get an 85? Which, it's satisfactory. You're not somebody we're going to have to worry about. You're not somebody we're worried about failing out of medical school and that we're devoting a ton of resources to. But 15% is still a chunk of information that you don't know. And, we kind of had no resources and no answers for them previously, and now we do. And then we gave student performance comparison to the class, because certain areas are going to be more difficult, especially in something like medicine. There's going to be things that are just extraordinarily difficult for our students that are maybe at a level that our students need to learn it, but you're setting them up for learning it again later. So you're really not expecting them to learn 100% of it. And when they see that they got a 50% on that topic, they freak out, because if you're a medical student, you've never gotten a 50% in your life. I can guarantee you that. And they don't seem to react too well when they do get a 50%. But then when they look at the class and they can say, oh, well, the class is getting 45% on this, well, I'm okay. And that was really useful to our students to kind of help them with their self-directed learning. Do I need to spend all my time on this area where I'm getting a 50, or is that actually normal for where I am in my educational progress, and I can devote my time elsewhere? And then lastly, longitudinal performance. And this is my personal favorite part of all of it. The longitudinal performance gives us the ability to analyze these categories over all of the exams. So every single exam a student takes has some pathology on it, some biochemistry on it, some physiology on it. But And we can see from exam to exam what those are, but it might be 7 questions here, 10 questions there, those sort of things. But longitudinally, that might be 150, 200 questions over the course of our curriculum. So while we don't have a biochemistry course anymore because we've integrated our curriculum and we don't do individual courses based on subject areas, we do still have the ability to say, how are you doing in biochemistry? Where when we first integrated our curriculum, here's what you got on the cardio exam. We don't know whether the 15% you missed or the 30% you missed was the cardio biochemistry, or was it the cardiopathology, or was it the cardiophysiology? We couldn't really tell you, especially because so many questions are multidisciplinary. So what part of this question is it that's actually making you miss? We can't say that you don't know the anatomy of the heart when it could have been this part about the diagnosis that you didn't understand, or so on and so forth. Here is an example of an exam performance breakdown. And you can kind of see here it's laid out really nicely for the students. We give them the number of questions that are in each category so that they don't obsess over something that, there was only 1 or 2 questions of. And obviously this is sample data. This isn't real data because of, privacy concerns for students. But, it gives you kind of a picture of what they can look at. And in this particular example, you've got a student who's doing really, really well in recall, but their clinical science vignettes, which for non-medical schools means, a patient comes in with these symptoms and you have to figure out what they have. Then once you figure out what they have, you have to figure out what to treat them with. And then once you figure out what to treat them with, you have to answer a question that's actually about a side effect of the treatment. So it's a cognitive several-step process to answer those questions. And, for this student, they're getting an 85, but what is the 15% they're missing? Well, theirs is in those kind of multiple step type questions. Also, you can look at this student's performance and see they do really well with normal processes. How does the liver work? The liver takes this enzyme and does such and such with it. But the abnormal processes, what happens when organs aren't functioning right? What functions when you have an infection, or when you have a disease, or when you have some sort of genetic issue, or anything in medicine? Abnormal, they're really struggling with. And so these are some things that can really cue us to how to help them. As we go forward here, this is how we show the students how they're comparing to the class. And we give them these periodically throughout the year so they can see, how am I doing in different question types? How am I doing in different general areas? Maybe it's a set of subcategories that are particularly important. And this is where, maybe the whole class, for instance, let me use the little highlighter tool here. If I have it, I might as well use it. The class as a whole is doing, 70, 75% or so in this category here, and this student's doing well. And so while this may be a student who's used to getting 100 on everything and is freaking out that they're maybe only at an 80 when it comes to this particular type of question, they can look and compare themselves to the class and see, oh, it's actually okay. That's not a big deal. The longitudinal performance category is very valuable because it gives you the most valid data. As you saw before, there were some categories that only had 1, 5, 10 questions in it when we did the data for an individual exam. But when you look at the longitudinal performance across all of the exams, you've got 1,100 recall questions, 300 vignette questions, 600 normal and 900 abnormal questions, and it gets to a point where you can solidly say, this is the student's performance in this area. And what we also do is, instead of just using this at the end, once it's all the way to these built-up numbers, we use it periodically. We run this report for students several times a year, so these numbers continue to build and continue to build and continue to build, and we use that data as they go. And then we'll talk about that in a moment when I talk about intervention and how we use these things to intervene. But you get a very valid set of data, and this, going into licensure, for us, our students have 6 weeks off in our curriculum to go study for their licensure exams. Well, that's a limited amount of time, and they've got to study for very certain things. So rather than take the time to spend on something like, pharmacology down here where they're getting an 89%, maybe they need to spend that time on, I don't know, general principles of health and disease, or biochemistry where they're much lower and in the 70s. And the students have usually study plans, and they work with counselors to figure these things out, or they may go out and buy classes from Kaplan or whoever else. They can they can use this data to, when they have free days in those study schedules, to say, what am I going to use my free day on? What am I going to put an extra emphasis on? Or am I going to punt a category altogether and focus on these other ones because, I can handle that category. I'm not going to study it. I need to work on these ones that I just can't handle right now. And so it gives the students a lot more control and direction of their own learning and their own study skills and their own study plans. Some of the other applications for this as we go forward. Oh, my PowerPoint seems to be stuck. There it is. Real quick to touch on, because they're not really the point of this, but they're great side things that we get from using this TeddyQ system. Item banking, we have a fully searchable item bank that we can search by any one of these categories at any time. If a professor comes to me and says, I need some questions for my exam that cover this, this, and this, I can look through our categories, filter by them, search by them, and say, here's some questions about that from our bank to fill in this hole in your exam. It allows us to do exam blueprinting. We know how many questions from each category are on each exam, and how many of those, how those categories apply to our blocks. So, we don't have any in our exam about this category, and this category is a subject that we taught in the block a lot. So it really gives us a clear blueprint to make sure that we're validly testing what we taught, which helps us improve exam quality from every sense of using the statistical analysis to making sure the exams represent what we taught. All those different things improve our exam quality. We get a lot more effective performance feedback, and that's what we're going to spend some time talking about here in just a moment. For remediation, we took away our students' ability to see the exams if they fail an exam. They don't get to see it. They get a report instead, and they have to use that report to choose what to study before they take a remediation exam and can progress within our curriculum. And that's one where, when we first got that feature, we allowed them to do both. And what we would do is they'd come in, they'd review their exam, they'd write down a bunch of stuff that they thought they needed to study, and then I would give them their report as they left for them to take home with them to study for the remediation. And anecdotally, one of the things that just blew my mind was the students would come out and they'd have this list. All right, I know what I got to study now. I can't believe I missed all this stuff. I know what to focus on. All right. And well, here, let's go over this report real fast. Let's just go over it. I know you think you've got it all under control, but let's go over it. And as we go over it, they wrote down all the things they did the best on, and they completely missed that they needed to work on all these other things that were actually the reason they failed. And it really showed us that the students can't necessarily interpret what they're missing when they miss a question, and that they're not, students who are struggling and failing frequently aren't self-aware enough to really know where the problems are. It gives us a much better relevance for preparing for our board exams, which I've touched on a lot, and I'm going to touch on some more. Curricular management, and then for accreditation, to be able to say, here's what I tested, where I tested it, how our students performed on it, here's how our school's performing in this area overall, et cetera, really helps with the accreditation process. So as we go through, there's different types of students. The underperforming student who's struggling to achieve their minimal competency within the curriculum, failing exams, borderline going to make it through the curriculum or not. They're usually the students that we end up spending the most time and resources on. Also, we've got the average student. And the average student is something that, in comparison to the underperforming student, gets neglected a little bit. They're doing okay. They're not great. They're not terrible, but you know what? They're not going to cause us problems, and these underperforming ones are hurting our failure rates and our dropout rates and our board scores and everything else. So we end up focusing more time on them. And then we have a third group, which I apologize, for some reason it's not showing up here, and that's the high-achieving student. And the high-achieving student probably gets the least attention of all because they're excelling, they don't need much maintenance, they can do it on their own, they're grasping things well, and they're really, the forefront of your curriculum. They're the students that you want to trumpet, and you don't have to work on them. Well, as we go forward, when we look at student A here, our first example, and this is an example of a student who's underperforming. This student who's underperforming is, basically, if you look at this longitudinal analysis, is getting by based on recall. They can study things, they can remember them, but they cannot synthesize data, because if you look at how they do on basic science vignettes, which is a patient scenario question that really is truly testing a basic science fact or a basic science concept, but it's kind of wrapped in a patient presents with these symptoms and comes to your office complaining about this. Sometimes those questions aren't really testing anything clinical. They're more testing basic science concepts. So we categorize those separately. But they're struggling heavily with clinical science vignettes. If you look down a little bit further, they're doing okay on normal processes. Here's the liver. Here's how it works. Here's the kidneys. Here's how they work. You know, blood goes in and out of the ventricles and provides this and that and whatever. Well, they're doing great on that, but when it comes to the abnormal processes, which is what you're going to see as a doctor, they're really struggling with those things. And then if you come down and you look at their subject areas, that kind of gets borne out there as well. If you look at gross anatomy and embryology down here, 83.5%. That's an area where you can memorize things pretty well. Nutrition, lots of facts. You can memorize things pretty well. But if you take a look at some things like the cardiovascular system, not doing well at all. In fact, below our passing rate is 70% for a block. So if this were a block instead of a category, they would be failing it. Gastrointestinal system, 70%. Coming back down here, pathology, 67%. Renal, 65%. So this student, when it comes to the things that you have to put it together, when you have to string these different facts together and go to a higher cognitive process, they're really struggling. And so this is a student where a lot of the times we need to change how a student studies. And this is, you know, these examples are all very specific to medical school, but in general, they're educational problems that we have. We need to change how a student studies. They're used to studying the way they studied in high school or in undergrad, or they're used to studying for their, you know, the way they study for their history class versus how they study for an organic chemistry class, and they're approaching it wrong. And sometimes it's study skills. Sometimes it's, you know, instead of sitting and writing things out over and over and over again, you need to stop writing the notes and use the electronic notes that are provided and work on synthesizing it by practice studying, by doing problems and practice cases instead of looking at the notes themselves, working through example cases instead of just looking at the facts over and over again, helps you start to kind of draw those things together and make sense of it. And so we can give this to our counselor. They can look it over. They can pick out the subject areas that they want to find them a tutor in based on how they're performing in the different subject areas. And then they can start to approach them about, well, how are you studying? Let's look at how you're studying, and let's see how we can tweak it. How much time are you spending studying? Things along those lines, and we can start to intervene. And because these reports, we can run them at any time throughout the curriculum, and we run them frequently, we're dealing with these things as they happen, rather than waiting for the end of the semester and saying, oh, well, we had somebody fail. Okay, well, we'll deal with that, and they'll have to repeat, or we'll kick them out. Instead, we're trying to stop that bad result that we all dread from ever happening in the first place, and we're trying to make that process more efficient, because it's just not practical to intervene with all of the students at a very deep level. And this helps us target with the time we spend with the students so that it's more effective. If you look at student B is kind of your average student. And they're somebody who says, okay, well, I'm getting my 80, 85%, 89%, somewhere in there, but how can I excel? What am I missing? What am I not getting? And why can't I get myself into that upper echelon of students? Why am I not at the top of the class? I want to excel because I want to be competitive when it comes to grad schools, or in our case, residencies. You know, that's student B. And in student B's case, we can sit down with them because of this breakdown in data and say, okay, well, you're recalling things fine, but when I look at your clinical science vignettes, those are fine too, so you clearly can synthesize information. But wait, the basic science vignette, that's a 74%. That's the outlier number for this student. And, you know, as we sat down with student B, and student B is a real example, one of the things we found was that the things in our curriculum that were presented to them as basic or foundational sciences, some of the biochemistry, which, you know, as you look down here and see this number, hey, that's a concern area. Some of the things like that, they were not approaching with any sort of clinical mindset. They were approaching it, they were a science major in undergrad, that's how they were approaching that content. But that's not how that content's tested in a medical school environment. So we altered the students' approach to basic science content to get them to think more clinically about it, think more patient-based about basic science content, and use that to increase their scores. And that's where you can see they did well in the areas that were heavily clinical, like cardio and GI, principles of health and disease, all those sorts of things. But it was this right up here, this biochemistry that was getting to them, a couple other places as well. And that was the main focus for this student. And again, rather than saying, well, you just need to do a little bit better in all these areas, we were able to find something that was a weakness that previously this student would have simply gotten an 89 on the test and we wouldn't have known why. We honestly could not tell them why, and we could not pick out trends in performance. As you go on to student C is the high-performing student. And the high-performing student, one of the things with our high-performing students is they're neglected, as I talked about earlier. They aren't at risk. We're not worried about them not graduating or not matching into a residency or not getting into grad school or not finding a job. These are the students that are they're there, they learn, they give us good scores, and they go away. But in this particular case, and again, this example is a little bit specific to medical school, we have a summer off. The only summer you get off is between your Med 1 year and your Med 2 year. After that, you go all the way through the summers in medical school. And this student was looking at trying to figure out, how do I plan for my career in medicine? I don't know what I want to specialize in yet. I seem to be pretty good at everything, and I'm going to have options available to me. How do I develop an advanced competency? How do I set myself apart in that way? And so one of the things we looked at as we went through this person's performance, and we said, okay, well, you're doing really, really well in neurology. I mean, 98% on 300 and some questions is an obscenely high number. And 98% on 187 in pathology was an extremely high number. So as that student looked at what they were going to do, our counselors and our deans who work with students to help get them research positions or help them find something to work on over the summer that's going to be of benefit to them in their educational and medical careers, said, why don't you go do some research in either pathology or neurology? And it just so happened that there was a lab that was doing some neuropathology research that needed an extra person in the lab for the summer. And so this person went there, found out they loved it, and now is kind of going through their Med 2 and Med 3 and Med 4 years, setting themselves up to try and get into neurology as a specialty. And they're taking electives that are more, neuropsych type based. They are they're continuing research with these people and doing it in their spare times as they go through and taking educational electives to do some research and things like that. And they join the neurology interest group and all these different things. And they're now they were able to use this data to outline something that is going to develop an advanced competency for them, something that's going to help them in their career and help them decide what they want to do and how they want to do it. And so that when this person graduates, we feel pretty confident they're going to get into neurology and they're going to be where they want to be. They're not going to get 2 years into their residency and say, I hate what I'm doing. What do I do now? So for the next steps, we want to maximize the use of this data and refine the curriculum and give students better feedback. And we want to utilize how we generate this for research on things such as our board performance, step 1, predictive performance, and intervention effectiveness. And one of the things I can share with you that we've done as our next steps is we've started to try and figure out how we can use this to predict better who's going to fail the board exams. And for years at our institution, if you got an 82, 83% in our curriculum or above, you passed the boards at 100% rate. If you got 82% or below, there was about a 25-30% chance you were going to fail the boards. Well, that range of students from 82% down to the lowest score in the class, which is usually 72, 71%, is about 30 or so students. And so about 1 in 4 of those is going to fail, but that's all you know about them. And there's no real rhyme or reason for where they are. Sometimes the lowest 3 people pass, and the 3 that were right up next to 82 end up failing, and sometimes it's different. So one of the things we do is we took this, and we took the longitudinal reports that we had, we took the individual exam reports, all these things, and we compared it to our performance on licensure exams. And one of the things we found was that when we viewed our students in different performance areas, we were able to find areas that better predicted step one failure. And if any of you here or if anyone from your institution is going to be at the IAMC conference this coming weekend and early next week, we're actually going to be there presenting this data. But the sneak peek of it is that when we looked at our students' performance in clinical vignette questions, we found that the range of students who failed went from 30 to 9. All of the students who failed the boards were in the, and we had 6 of them, were in the bottom 9 in performance in vignette area. And so instead of having to intervene an inch deep with 30 students, we're going to intervene a mile deep with 9 students. At least that's the plan, because we're going to now take this and go forward and change the way we do intervention with our students based on this. And we also looked at some things. If you take the original grouping of students, the 30 who failed the boards, and say, okay, well, here's the average score of the 6 students who actually failed in clinical vignettes, and that's 72%. And if you look at the average score of the students in that range who didn't fail but we had deemed at risk, theirs is closer to 67 or 76, 77%. So you get about a significant difference there in the performance of those students in this category, whereas if you just looked at their overall performance in our curriculum, you would have said, oh, well, they both have 75 averages. They both have 78 averages for the year. What's the difference between these 2 students? Well, this really allows us to go to that next level and find that out. And we're finding that we don't have to wait till the end of our curriculum right before they take the boards to do this. Our students take our licensure exam at the end of their Med 2 year. We ran the data for the Med 1 year, and the ranges are broader. The students who failed were spread out amongst 50 ranks in our Med 1 class. But when we ranked it by vignette, that shrunk to about 22. So even though 22 is still more than you'd want to have to intervene with and expend the resources on because you only have so many tutors and so many academic counselors, that's still much better than trying to predict who out of 50 is going to fail. And so you put those 20 into peer study groups and tutor groups, and they meet with the professor and go to office hours and those sorts of things because they've been able to be identified all the way back during Med 1 rather than waiting till the end. And, oh, you failed the board, so we got a problem now. What do we do? Take it again. Use this to study. Here, take this class. We're going to scramble and try and figure something out. Now we can be proactive about it and we can track it. Now, unfortunately, we've only got 1 year of data that we can do this analysis on because it's all new. But we will be getting another set of data come August, and if this holds, then I think this is going to represent a pretty great opportunity for us to really change how we intervene with students, how we help them, what resources we provide, and the ability to do that targetedly and better use our resources and really help the students who need it. So with that, we will open it up to some questions. I think there's a text box somewhere. Ken, if you want to jump on and tell them how to type in the questions.
Yeah, this is Ken. I'm back again. The question button is on the right-hand side of the screen. You'll see a box that says questions, and you should be able to type in your question there. So feel free to type in and ask any questions. Eric, I know we have some people who are having problems being seen, and I got a couple of emails with some questions. So I'll give it a second to see if we have any questions from here. If not, then I will read you the questions that we've gotten in thus far.
Sounds great.
So, first question. Go ahead.
I was going to say, as we wait for some questions, one of the things that I think I went through a little quickly earlier, but that I wanted to step back and talk about for just a moment is the key to all of this for us was in the design and implementation of this, identifying what was truly valid and important for us to track. And you'll notice that I spent a lot of my time talking about the question types, the general areas, and the subject areas, and not a lot of time talking about the authors and the subtopics and those sorts of things. That's because while they have some nominal usage here and there and can be helpful in certain times, they didn't end up really being what was valuable to us. And it kind of took us until we saw all the data we were getting back that we could really screen through and find what was important to us. And everything I talked about, because we're a medical school, was very medical school, centric. But, when I've talked to people who run educational programs here, and we're talking about teachers who are going to have to go take the praxis exam for getting licensure there, or our nursing school, there's they have things. For us, the thing to watch was how they scored on vignettes. Every school and every educational area can identify things like that they know are the important skills for students, but they don't have a way of tracking it, and this really provides that way of tracking it. So it may not be vignette-style questions for you. It may be something else, but in general, there's usually something.
So I did put a question. Do you see it? Do you see it?
Yes, I do. Do you have any process in place for validating the question items themselves? Yes, we do. We have what we call our test item review program, and our test item review program is run by myself and one of our faculty members, and it has 12 other faculty members who are part of the team, and we actually go through and review each question. And so we go through, is this relevant? Is this accurate? And, is this actually worded in the form of a question? We get so many that say, like, red blood cells, colon. And then there's a bunch of answer choices that are 3 sentences each. Well, that's not a good question. So we review for things like that. Additionally, we do heavy statistical analysis on them. We're looking at the point by serial to see if, does doing well on this question actually mean doing well on the exam? If not, why? We need to work on that with that question. Does it need to be thrown out, or does it, do we need to change the way we teach it? Also, the discrimination index is something we spend a lot of time looking at. If only 50% of the class is getting it right, that can be good or that can be bad, because if 90% of your top students get it right and only 30% of your lowest performing students get it right, well, that's good. You're just discriminating between your learners, and there is going to be a range of learners in every school, and so you're going to have to find a way to assign. For us, it's honors and letters, or different things like that, honor roll, whatever it may be. You don't want everybody getting 100 on the test, but you want to make sure that what you're putting in there to cause people to not get 100 on the test, you're not tricking them. It's not a cheap question, and so we do a lot of that kind of stuff. So our team meets every 2 weeks to go through questions. We may usually go through 20, 25. Every 2 weeks. And once we do this completely through our whole bank, which we haven't done before, we'll probably slow it down a little bit and only review newly written questions and review other questions only as the stats show a need to. But right now we're doing our entire bank as a complete and total look through to see what we need to fix and what we need to get better at. And then every single exam, the first thing I do afterwards is analyze the statistics in depth. It looks like we have another question here. Did you look at other exam softwares? I'm thinking of question mark particularly. We are looking at both products for testing. Well, obviously we use ExamSoft, and not to sound too biased and not to bash somebody else's product, but we spent 6 years in perception. So the first thing I have to tell you is if you're looking at perception or question mark perception, I'm sorry, because I lived that horrific nightmare, and that's why I will speak so strongly about it. We lost on average 10 exams every time we gave one. The student finishes, hits the button. Oh, it's like you never even took the exam. No score. You go get a glass of water, sit back down, and start over. So, yeah, every school's got to look at what they need. We looked at ExamSoft, and it really met our needs. We haven't lost a single exam from them, and it gave us the ability to do this kind of stuff. None of the other softwares we looked at, and we looked at several, exam.com, LXR, we were in question mark perception already, Desire to Learn, Blackboard, some of these other ones. We looked at all of them, and they didn't give us this kind of data power, the ability to longitudinally analyze things and things like that, and track our students' performance in these advanced metric ways. And additionally, we didn't want to keep having to give our exams in a lab. It's expensive. It's hard to. We have a class this year of 285 students. We have our biggest lab on campus is 85. So we had to do multiple sessions to get them through if we would have done that. Whereas ExamSoft provided a secure way to do it on the laptops and do it without requiring constant connectivity, because wireless is a particularly poor medium. It's not built to handle constant connectivity without a single drop for really, really extended periods of time on something that's high stakes. It's just not meant for that. Our network engineers came in, we spent $90 grand upgrading our auditoriums, and we still have a failure rate of like 10% when we try and do exams that require constant connectivity for hours and hours. It doesn't work. So for us, this really, really met the needs. We looked at a lot. if you shoot me your email address, I think somewhere, and I may have given it to Ken one day, somewhere I have a list of the different products we went through and kind of comparing their features and things like that. It's a few years old because we've been with ExamSoft now for almost 4 years, so it's from back then. But we went through and did a comprehensive search, and we've been really pleased with where we are.
All right, Eric, I've got a couple other questions that for some reason aren't appearing up here.
Okay.
One is, how have the reports affected the way professors interact with the students?
That's a really good question. It goes back to that guesswork thing that I was talking about. The professors in our curriculum, we probably, in a single block that's 4 to 5 weeks long, we have maybe 30 different people teaching our students over the course of those 4 to 5 weeks. And so they don't have an extensive amount of face time with the students. It's not like somebody you get to know over the course of a semester and you kind of start to figure out who they are as a student and what their strengths and what their weaknesses and all those things are. It's a lot more difficult when you're only in for 1 or 2 hours. And the student's struggling on your stuff, but you don't know what else they struggle on. You don't know what they're good at. And so when a student goes to meet with either our counselors, our tutors, any of our professors, our program directors, our faculty, anybody, they email me, they say, hey, I'm meeting with the student, can you send me their reports? And I send their reports over to them. And so when they say, I want to know why I'm struggling and I'm not going to get honors in your block, and I want to know why I'm not getting honors in your block, because I've gotten honors in every other block, and this is ridiculous, and your block is just, you don't test us right, or your block is poorly taught, because how come I can get honors in everything else and not in your area? That's everybody has students like that. Well, we can sit down and say, okay, well, here's where you're struggling, and here's where the issues come in, and here's what you need to work on to improve those things, and here's a way to target that. And or it's just a student who says, I want to do better, I want to learn more about this, whatever. Well, they can use these to know a little bit about the students, have a little bit of a head start about the students before the student walks into their office, so that the time they spend with the student is really talking about what they need to get at with the students, not figuring out, well, okay, have you struggled in the past on anything? Wait for the student to describe that for 15 minutes. Well, what do you think you're struggling with right now? Wait for them to go over that for 15 minutes. You know those things, and now you can get to the action plan first.
We have 2 more. Has this helped you prepare for the accreditation,
Absolutely. One of the things accreditation-wise that has helped us a lot is, we set standards, and one of the things our accrediting body is the LCME, and they give us a bunch of rules and guidelines, but in addition to that, we say, here's what we're going to teach. We promise to assess it, and we promise that we'll make our students competent in these things. And then they hold you accountable to your own standards. And I'm making the process pretty primitive in that description, but that's kind of the gist of it. And so what this has been able to say is, okay, here are our core educational objectives. They link to our learning objectives, and those learning objectives are throughout the curriculum. So now we can say, here's where we taught it, by looking at our we gave a lecture on this subject, and here's where we tested that. And our classes on a whole, we can say they're competent on this because they took, 150 questions on pathology and they're scoring this. Or at the very least, maybe it's not necessarily proving competency, but proving we are assessing what we say we're assessing. Here's every subtopic that we test and showing that. And being able to kind of document and just roll reports out of that kind of stuff rather than looking around and saying, did we actually go over this in an exam somewhere 4 years ago? Yeah, I think so. Let's try and find it. Oh, I think this question covers that. Yeah, okay, we did assess this. Well, now we know. And even more than that, it goes to the planning, because usually it's not a results thing where you get to the end and you say, oh, we did or didn't do this. It's we need to make sure we do X, Y, and Z. So now we can look at our exams, and by using the categorizations, and one of the things we've added this year is learning objectives are one of our categories. Every single one of our questions is linked to a learning objective. And the learning objective are linked to our lectures, our e-learning modules, and so on and so forth. And so now we can say we taught all these learning objectives, and we look at the test, and learning objectives 1 through 122 are lit there, but 123, 124 aren't there, and then on the 125 and so on are there again. Well, we need some questions over those learning objectives. We get those in, and now we know we're assessing what we teach. And so from the blueprinting perspective ahead of time, to make the accreditation process easier later is one of the highest values.
Great. And one last question for you. How has this process saved you time when grading?
Wow, that's a big question, because one of the things that we used to have to do was export our data, clean our data up, put it into a third-party software, score it, look at those results. Then you see that, oh, 22% of the class got question 5 right, you need to throw it out. Go back into the data, change the data so that that question doesn't get scored anymore, rerun it through our scoring process, and you can't do anything categorically with that because you'd have to do it manually. What we now do is we hit a button, we see scores. We hit another button, we see the reports that detail out to us how the students did on every single question, their discrimination, their point by serial, percent correct, all those different things. We say, okay, we don't like 3, 52, and 86. We're going to accept 2 answers on 86. We're going to throw out 3 and 52. You hit 4 buttons and those things happen, and you rescore the exam. It instantly rescores the entire exam, generates new stats for you, and all your student scores are now updated to reflect the changes to make sure that they're only being scored on what is valid. And then you can do all this categorical stuff. So, one of the interesting things for us is, when I started, it was me, and I made all the exams, I scored all the exams, and I reported out the student scores. When I put all this categorization stuff into place and all this data into place in these reports and started utilizing it, all these different things, it's still just me. But the difference is I'm now spending my time on finding trends in the data, helping the students with it, getting it out to our faculty, raising awareness of it, helping them utilize it better, rather than spending my time on mining through the data to delete question number 5 from every student so that they don't get scored on it because it was a horrible question. So it's made us more efficient, which has enabled us to do more. And from a student perspective, when I was talking about before with the other product, what the issues we were having, when you lose 10 exams every single time and it's random, and the students, they get to know that. You take 22 exams a year, you know what's happening. And I get to the point, I walk around a room, and if I started to walk up to somebody, they would tense up. And they would start freaking out, thinking I was about to tell them that their exam was gone and they needed to start over because they knew that that was a thing that happened. Or they'd walk into the exam, and as they're signing in on the sign-in sheets, they'd be like, so how's the exam software doing today? Has there been a lot of people who've lost it or only a few this time? And these are the questions I started getting on an exam-by-exam basis. And our students are thinking about softwares and whether it's going to work, and can I get a flight home after the exam because I might have to retake it, and I'd miss my flight if I had to retake it, and all these things. And now that's not the questions I get. That's not the emphasis of the students. The emphasis of the students is thinking about the material. They're not thinking about the software at all. And so that's a big shift for our students and our staff.
Well, Eric, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you presenting, and thank you to everybody who attended the webinar today. Boys, we recorded this webinar. It'll take us a day or so to get the recorded webinar posted to the web, and we will send out an email with a link to this webinar. And we look forward to having you join us to other webinars in our series. Eric, thanks again for your time, and thanks to everybody who joined us for today's webinar.
Thank you.